By the summer of 1944, Army Group Center was clinging to a 1,000-kilometer arc of territory that jutted eastward into Soviet-held Belarus. German staff officers called it the Belarusian Balcony. From Polotsk through Vitebsk and Orsha, then down past Mogilev and Bobruisk to the Pripyat marshes, this bulge separated Soviet forces and created the illusion of a German stronghold. But it wasn't a stronghold. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. The geography itself conspired against defense. The western Dvina flowed through Vitebsk, and its broad floodplains and marshy northern approaches forced German units into thin linear deployments. South through the Dnieper Valley, the terrain opened into mixed forests of pine and birch, broken up by peat bogs and oxbow lakes that turned roads to mud after summer rains. The few paved routes all converged on the same critical nodes, and that transformed these cities into the load-bearing pillars of the entire defensive architecture. Control a city, and you controlled a sector. Lose a city, and you'd lose everything behind it. Yet, Army Group Center held this impossible frontage with barely 38 divisions, and many of them were skeletal. The average division defended 20 to 25 kilometers of front. In the marshy sectors north of Vitebsk, weak Luftwaffe field divisions stretched across 35 kilometers or more, creating what German officers grimly called fronts without reserves. Companies of 40 men held battalion sectors, and when requests for reinforcements came back, they brought drafts of convalescents and retrained ground crew. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber had stopped counting the days. The calendar meant nothing in the forward positions, where time measured itself in the rhythm of shovel strikes against wet sand and the intervals between Soviet reconnaissance flights. The trench ran through a stand of birch trees, their white bark peeling in strips that reminded Weber of dead skin. His sector was 40 meters wide. He shared it with 11 other men from what had once been a company of 120. The rest were gone, transferred to other gaps in the line, evacuated with frostbite that had never properly healed, or buried in the shallow graves behind the supply depot. The soil here was strange. Sandy on the surface, but waterlogged underneath, so that every excavation filled with groundwater within hours. Weber's boots hadn't been dry since April. The leather had softened and split along the seams, and the skin of his feet had turned the color of old cheese. When he peeled off his socks at night, the flesh came away in thin, translucent sheets. He dug anyway. They all dug. The orders came down every evening: deepen the positions, extend the communication trenches, and reinforce the bunker roofs with another layer of logs. The pine trunks they used for overhead cover wept sap in the heat, and the amber beads collected flies. At night, the insects crawled across sleeping faces, and Weber had learned to breathe through his nose to avoid swallowing them. The observation post was 200 meters forward in a shell crater reinforced with sandbags and a single MG-42 on a tripod mount. From there, on clear mornings, the Soviet lines were visible as a dark scar across the forest. Fresh earth thrown up in berms, the glint of wire, and occasionally the movement of figures too distant to identify. Weber had been watching them for 6 weeks. They were building something. Corduroy roads, the veteran said. Logs laid perpendicular across the marsh, creating paths where no paths should exist. The Soviets worked at night, and by dawn, the forest swallowed their labor. But Weber could see the results: fresh vehicle tracks appearing in sectors that should have been impassable, and faint geometric lines of timber visible through his binoculars when the morning mist lifted. He reported this. The reports went up the chain. Nothing came back. The smell of the position was its own geography: pine sap and latrine lime. The metallic tang of the water they pumped from a shell hole. The sweetness of decay from something buried nearby that they'd never found. And underneath it all, the constant earthy musk of damp wool and unwashed men. Weber wrote to his wife that spring, "This is a quiet sector, which isn't quiet at all. We hold points along a line, But the line is too long for us. Every night, the Russians come closer. I can feel them in the forest, waiting. He never received a response. On the 8th of March, 1944, Leader Order Number 11 formalized what had been evolving since January. Selected cities would become Feste Plätze, fortress cities to be defended to the last man by commandants personally responsible to the Führer. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, the nodal anchors of Army Group Center's front, received their designation that spring. No withdrawal would be permitted from these strongpoints without Hitler's explicit order. The doctrine was clear. Fanatical resistance would replace elastic defense. Space couldn't be traded for time. Field Marshal Ernst Busch transmitted these orders downward without resistance. Rigid and dutiful, a soldier whose loyalty to Hitler was beyond question, Busch lacked the operational independence shown by commanders like Model or Manstein. Where others might argue, delay, or interpret orders creatively, Busch complied. His staff officers watched him relay fortress directives with Prussian correctness, even as they understood what it meant. Divisions would be chained to static positions, unable to maneuver and unable to escape encirclement. One corps commander later wrote bitterly of orders that created encirclements against ourselves. In Vitebsk, over 30,000 men of the 206th and 246th Infantry Divisions, along with other units, dug into the city's perimeter that spring. They reinforced bunkers, laid wire, and stockpiled ammunition for a siege they didn't yet understand would become their execution. The man responsible for defending that cage was General Friedrich Gollwitzer, commander of the 53rd Corps. By June of 1944, he'd been a professional soldier long enough to recognize an untenable position when he occupied one. Vitebsk jutted eastward into Soviet-held territory like a fist thrust into the enemy's chest, its northern and northwestern flanks dangerously exposed. The salient's geometry was elementary. Any Soviet breakthrough north or south of the city would sever the narrow corridor connecting 53rd Corps to the rest of 3rd Panzer Army. Gollwitzer knew it. His superior, General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding 3rd Panzer Army, knew it better. Reinhardt had already recommended withdrawal. The response came through from Colonel General Seitzler at the Army High Command as the noose tightened in mid-June. The Führer has decided that Vitebsk is to be held as a fortified place. No elastic defense, no calculated withdrawal to shorter defensible lines. The city would be held. Feldwebel Otto Brenner had been Luftwaffe ground crew before the conversion. He'd serviced Messerschmitt engines at an airfield near Königsberg, and his hands still remembered the weight of wrenches, the precise torque required to seat a spark plug. Now those same hands held a Karabiner 98K, and the men he commanded had never fired their weapons in combat. The bunker was 12 meters long and 3 meters wide, carved into a low rise southwest of Vitebsk. The walls were packed earth reinforced with timber, and the ceiling was 3 layers of pine logs covered with a meter of soil and sod. It smelled of wet wood and kerosene, and the single lamp threw shadows that moved when the wind shook the entrance curtain. Brenner had 23 men under his command. The youngest was 17, a conscript from Saxony whose voice hadn't finished breaking. The oldest was 52, a railway worker from Pomerania who wheezed when he climbed stairs and couldn't run more than 50 meters without stopping. These were the reinforcements that had arrived in May. Convalescents who hadn't fully healed, retrained ground crew who'd never held a frontline position, and older men pulled from essential war industries. They'd been given 3 weeks of infantry training before deployment, 3 weeks to learn what regular infantry learned in months. Brenner watched them fumble with their weapons during drills, watched them flinch at the distant thump of artillery that they hadn't yet learned to read. They didn't know how to judge distance by sound, how to identify the caliber of an incoming shell by its whistle, or how to press themselves flat in the split second between hearing and impact. The position they held was 35 kilometers of front. On paper, they were a division. In reality, they were a line of isolated strongpoints connected by telephone wire that Soviet partisans cut every third night. What Gollwitzer couldn't see, what no German reconnaissance aircraft detected, what foreign armies east under Reinhard Gehlen never predicted, was the most sophisticated deception operation the Red Army had yet mounted. It was a campaign of lies conducted in radio frequencies and rail schedules, in dummy tanks and silent forests, across 1,000 kilometers of front. While Gehlen's intelligence apparatus tracked Soviet tank armies massing in Ukraine and predicted the main blow would fall toward Romania, those same tank armies had already departed. Dummy radio nets crackled with false traffic, simulating armored concentrations in the south. Phantom headquarters transmitted movement orders for divisions that no longer existed in their sectors. Soviet signals discipline was absolute. Stavka banned any mention of Operation Bagration on radio, enforcing silence so complete that German intercept stations heard only the echoes of a southern offensive that would never materialize. The real armies moved north under cover of darkness. Night after night through May and June, trains rolled toward Belarus, carrying 20 combined arms armies, 2 tank armies, 5 air armies, 1.5 million men with their guns and vehicles. Strict camouflage discipline governed every movement. Staff officers flew reconnaissance over their own positions, checking that no vehicle tracks scarred the earth and no concentration showed through the canopy. Civilians were evacuated to prevent loose talk. By day, the forests appeared empty. Then, on the night of June 19th, Soviet partisans struck. Approximately 140,000 partisans detonated 10,000 demolition charges simultaneously across the German rear. Railroad junctions, bridges, and supply points erupted in coordinated destruction. The rail war severed German logistics and reconnaissance alike, isolating Army Group Center in the crucial days before the storm. German intelligence detected nothing. The forests remained silent. Gehlen's maps showed strength in the south and weakness in Belarus. Reserves stayed where the phantom armies pretended to mass. On the morning of June 21st, a German soldier near Vitebsk noted in his diary that Russian forces seemed unusually close during the night. He would understand why at 3 the next morning. At 5 o'clock on the morning of June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years to the hour after Hitler's armies had crossed into Soviet territory, 7,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers opened fire across the Belarusian front. German survivors would later describe it as the most intense and destructive barrage they had ever witnessed. For 2 hours, the earth convulsed under a rolling double barrage that struck frontline positions in rear areas simultaneously, a tactical innovation that left German units blind and paralyzed. Forward trenches flattened, bunkers collapsed inward, burying their occupants. Ammunition dumps detonated in chain reactions that sent columns of smoke boiling into the early summer sky. The sound merged into a single continuous roar that swallowed individual explosions. Men crouched in dugouts and felt the ground shake as 122mm howitzer shells hammered defensive wire into scrap metal, while Katyusha salvos turned strongpoints into craters. Smoke and dust became so thick that visibility dropped to meters. Field telephone lines, cut within minutes, left battalion and regimental command posts isolated. The first shell landed 30 meters behind Weber's position. The world turned inside out. He was on his belly before he knew he'd moved, face pressed into the wet sand, mouth full of grit and the taste of copper. The second shell landed closer. The third lifted him from the ground and threw him against the trench wall. And for a moment, he was looking at the sky, at the strobing flashes of artillery illuminating low clouds, at the tracer arcs of rockets streaming overhead. Then, the world filled with sound, and he stopped being a man and became a thing that crawled. The barrage had a rhythm, but it wasn't a rhythm Weber could read. The shells came in waves, First the heavy calibers that shook the ground and collapsed the dugouts, then the lighter pieces that swept the communication trenches, then the rockets that turned the wire into scrap and the parapets into craters. There was no pause. There was no lull. There was only the continuous percussion of destruction that Weber felt through his chest, through his teeth, and through the bones of his skull. He crawled toward the bunker. The entrance was 10 meters away, an eternity measured in explosions. His hands found a boot. He looked up. Private Schumann was sitting against the trench wall with his back very straight, his hands folded in his lap and his head missing. Weber kept crawling. The bunker entrance had collapsed. The logs that had formed the doorframe were splintered and jutting, and the earth behind them was settling in waves. Weber dug with his hands, fingernails tearing against wood and stone, but the soil kept sliding back. He could hear voices inside, not words, just sounds. The sounds that men make when they can't breathe. A shell landed on the bunker roof. The concussion threw Weber backward. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in a crater that hadn't existed 30 seconds before. His ears were ringing. His nose was bleeding. The bunker was gone, not collapsed, but gone, as if it had never existed. In its place was a smoking wound in the earth, 6 meters across and already filling with groundwater. Through the smoke, he could see them coming. Soviet infantry in their summer uniforms, moving in open order across the marsh. They walked calmly, rifles held at the ready, stepping over the bodies and the debris as if this were a training exercise. Weber had no weapon. He had no comrades. He had nowhere to go. He raised his hands. By the evening of June 23rd, the tactical situation had crystallized into a simple operational fact. 53rd Corps was being encircled. The Soviet thrusts from north and south had advanced deep enough to threaten the single highway running west from Vitebsk toward Lapel. Gollwitzer's staff officers marked the enemy positions on acetate overlays, measuring the shrinking corridor with dividers and string. The mathematics were unforgiving. Every hour of delay narrowed the escape route by another few hundred meters as Soviet rifle divisions closed from both flanks. Gollwitzer sent his assessment to Reinhardt at 3rd Panzer Army headquarters. Soviet forces had penetrated deep on both flanks. The roads west were under immediate threat, and encirclement was imminent. He requested permission to break out while the corridor remained open. The message was professional and urgent, devoid of panic. Reinhardt understood. He forwarded Gollwitzer's request up the chain with his own endorsement, warning that further delay would close the window entirely. The breakout had to happen now, tonight, while 53rd Corps retained mobility and cohesion. The answer came back through Bush. Vitebsk will be held. Stabsarzt Friedrich Vogel had been a surgeon at a hospital in Munich before the war. He'd trained in sterile operating theaters with adequate lighting, proper anesthesia, and nurses who knew the names of instruments. Now he worked in the cellar of a half-destroyed apartment building by the light of candles and a single kerosene lamp with supplies that had run out 3 days ago. The cellar was 30 meters long and 8 meters wide. It held 73 wounded men. There were supposed to be cots, but the cots had been used for timber when the upper floors collapsed. Now the wounded lay on the concrete floor, on blankets that had soaked through with blood, urine, and the drainage from infected wounds. The smell was its own presence in the room. Gangrene has a particular odor, sweetish and cloying, the scent of flesh turning to soup. It mixed with the sharp bite of phenol, the iron rust of dried blood, and the ammoniac reek of men who hadn't been able to reach the latrine bucket in time. Vogel had stopped noticing it hours ago. His nose had surrendered. The casualties from the morning's barrage had overwhelmed them. Vogel had amputated 3 limbs in the first 2 hours, sawing through bone with a blade that was no longer sharp enough for the work. He'd packed abdominal wounds with bandages that weren't clean. He'd administered morphine until the morphine was gone, and then he'd held men's hands while they screamed. Private Acker was in the corner. He was 19 years old, a telegraph operator from Hamburg, and he'd taken a shell fragment through the pelvis. Vogel had done what he could, which wasn't much. The fragment had shattered the iliac bone and torn through the intestines. Without surgery in a real hospital, Acker would develop peritonitis and die. Vogel knew this. Acker didn't. "Doctor," Acker said. His voice was very weak. "Will I be able to walk again?" Vogel looked at the boy's face, the smooth cheeks that hadn't yet needed regular shaving, the blue eyes that still held hope. "We'll do everything we can," Vogel said. "I was supposed to be married," Acker said, "in September. Her name is Elsa. She's waiting for me in Hamburg." Acker talked about Elsa. He talked about the dress she was going to wear, about the church where they'd planned the ceremony, and about the apartment they'd found near the harbor. He talked until his voice faded, until his eyes lost focus, until the hand in Vogel's grip went limp. By the evening of June 24th, the operational reality Gollwitzer had warned against became geographic fact. Advance elements of Bagramyan's First Baltic Front, driving south and southeast from the supposedly impassable terrain north of Vitebsk, met spearheads of Cherniakovsky's Third Belarusian Front, pushing northwest from Bogushevsk. The junction point lay in the forested marshy corridor 10 to 20 kilometers west of the city. Approximately 35,000 men were now trapped in a pocket that measured roughly 30 kilometers across at its widest point. 5 divisions, the 206th Infantry, the 246th Infantry, the 4th and 6th Luftwaffe field divisions, and remnants of supporting units were cut off from the rest of Army Group Center. The roads west, which Gollwitzer had pleaded to use while they were still open, now lay firmly under Soviet control. Supply by air was theoretically possible, but wholly inadequate for a force of this size. The fortress Hitler had insisted must be held at all costs had become, as Reinhardt had foreseen, a tomb. On June 26th, after repeated pleas from Reinhardt, Hitler authorized a partial breakout, but only 3 divisions could withdraw. The 206th Infantry Division would remain in Vitebsk as the fortress garrison, fulfilling the Fester Platz mandate to hold the city to the last man and the last bullet. It was the worst of both worlds, a compromise that satisfied neither operational necessity nor ideological purity, a half measure that guaranteed maximum casualties while achieving no military objective. The authorization arrived too late. By the morning of June 26th, Soviet forces had spent 2 full days strengthening the encirclement ring. Hitler, unwilling to accept that his designated fortress commander might act independently, insisted a staff officer be parachuted into the pocket to remind Gollwitzer that the 206th must not withdraw from the city under any circumstances. Reinhardt, in a rare moment of open defiance, countered that if anyone were to be parachuted in, it would be himself. That evening, Gollwitzer made his decision. He would order a full corps breakout, all divisions simultaneously, abandoning heavy equipment and wounded who couldn't walk. He would disobey. The breakout began after midnight on June 26th, under heavy rain that turned the roads to mud and muffled the sound of movement. Gollwitzer's order sent all divisions westward simultaneously, abandoning everything that couldn't walk or fight. The wounded who could move were carried by comrades. Those who couldn't were left behind with medical staff and whatever morphine remained. They ran straight into Soviet ambush positions. Bagramyan had anticipated exactly this move. The 39th Army had strengthened the encirclement ring throughout June 25th, positioning blocking detachments along every westward route. When German columns emerged from Vitebsk's perimeter in the darkness, Soviet artillery opened fire at close range. Machine guns swept the muddy roads. The rain that had hidden German preparations now trapped them in killing zones where vehicles bogged down and infantry bunched together. By dawn on June 26th, the breakout had shattered into fragments. Some small groups fought through the Soviet lines and reached German positions days later, exhausted and weaponless. Most were cut down in the forests west of the city or captured as daylight revealed their positions. Gefreiter Hans Müller was dying, and he knew it. The bullet had entered through his left side just below the rib cage and exited through his back. He could feel the wetness spreading beneath him, could feel his strength draining away with each pulse of his heart. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and they were soaking up his blood in a widening circle. The breakout had failed. Müller had understood this at approximately 0500 hours, when the column he was part of walked into a Soviet machine gun position and lost 40 men in the first 30 seconds. He'd been near the rear, and he had run, not forward into the fire, not back toward the city, but sideways, into the forest, where the trees might offer cover. He'd run for perhaps 200 meters before the bullet found him. Now, he lay on his back, looking up at the canopy. The light was filtering through the pine branches in shafts of gold, and somewhere above him a bird was singing. He could hear the sounds of fighting in the distance, but they seemed very far away. He thought about his mother. She lived in a small house in Schleswig-Holstein, near the Danish border, and she kept a garden where she grew roses, red roses. He could see them now, the velvet petals, the thorns, the way they caught the morning light. He tried to say her name. His lips moved, but no sound came out. At some point, Müller heard footsteps, boots crunching on pine needles, moving slowly. A face appeared above him, a young face with Slavic features and tired eyes. A Tihur soldier looked down at Müller without expression, and Müller looked back. For a moment, they were simply two young men in a forest, far from home. The Soviet soldier said something in Russian. Müller didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was simply final. The soldier raised his rifle. Model arrived at Army Group Center's headquarters on the morning of June 28th to inherit a catastrophe already beyond repair. Hitler had dismissed Bush 2 days earlier after the field marshal flew to Bavaria to plead for withdrawal permissions that came too late. The Führer's replacement, his fireman, summoned from Army Group North Ukraine, found not a front to stabilize but a disintegrating rout. The operational architecture had already collapsed. Vitebsk's fall had pulled the keystone from the arch. What happened at Vitebsk now replicated itself across the entire army group with mechanical inevitability. At Mogilev, 4th Army received permission to withdraw to the Berezina on June 26th, but the order arrived when Soviet forces had already severed the retreat routes. By June 28th, much of 4th Army had been destroyed east of the river, its divisions shattered in pockets, choked with burning vehicles and abandoned guns. At Bobruisk, 9th Army Commander Hans Jordan had warned in his diary that under directives requiring absolutely rigid defense, the front would be smashed. He was correct. Rokossovsky's 3rd Army drove toward the Berezina crossing at Bobruisk, while Bush, following Hitler's no-retreat injunction, refused to allow his infantry to withdraw across the river. By June 29th, 9 divisions were effectively destroyed in and around the city, the roads west littered with wrecked armor and the corpses of horses shot in their traces. By July 4th, Minsk fell. In the days that followed, the remnants of 4th and 9th Armies were encircled west of the city, in a pocket that yielded tens of thousands more prisoners, stumbling along cratered roads under constant air attack. Army Group Center suffered over 300,000 casualties. 28 of its 34 divisions were destroyed, a loss greater than Stalingrad. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber was walking. He'd been walking for 4 days, or perhaps 5. Time had lost meaning somewhere on the road from the collection point to wherever they were going. The column stretched ahead of him and behind him as far as he could see, thousands of men in torn and filthy uniforms shuffling. Forward, under the guns of Soviet guards, his feet were bleeding. The split leather of his boots had finally given way entirely, and the soles were held on with strips torn from his tunic. Each step sent a spike of pain up through his legs, but the pain had become familiar, almost comforting. It meant he was still alive. The road was lined with the debris of the retreat. Burned trucks with their cargoes spilled across the ditches, overturned wagons with the bodies of horses still in their traces, swelling in the July heat, shell craters filled with stagnant water and things that floated. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, sweet stench of decay that coated the inside of the mouth and refused to be forgotten. Weber didn't look at the bodies anymore. At first he'd tried to identify them, to match faces with names, to offer some internal memorial for comrades lost. He'd stopped on the second day when he realized the faces were no longer recognizable as faces. A Soviet guard walked past, his submachine gun cradled in his arms. He looked at the prisoners with an expression that was tired, contemptuous, and bored. The prisoners weren't people to him. They were cargo, a problem of logistics. Weber understood. He'd stopped being a person somewhere on the road. Now he was simply a body that walked, that breathed, that put one bleeding foot in front of the other because stopping meant lying down, and lying down meant dying. The column marched on. Ahead, the road curved toward the horizon. Behind, the smoke of Minsk still rose against the sky. Gefreiter Emil Hartmann was alone. The forest had swallowed him 3 days ago when the last of his group had been killed at a stream crossing. He'd run into the trees with bullets cutting the leaves around his head, and he'd kept running until his lungs burned and his legs refused to carry him further. Now, he sat with his back against a birch tree, watching the light fade. He had no food, he had no water, he had no weapon, he had a compass, but the compass pointed west, and west meant Soviet lines, and Soviet lines meant death or capture. The forest was quiet. No artillery, no small arms fire, no engines. Just the wind in the branches and the distant call of birds settling for the night. It was almost peaceful. Hartmann thought about the observation post where this had all begun. He thought about the moment when the horizon had erupted in fire and the world he knew had ended. His hands had stopped shaking. That was strange. They'd been shaking for weeks, and now they were still. He looked at them in the fading light, dirty, scraped, the nails torn to the quick. They didn't look like his hands anymore. They looked like the hands of someone else, someone he didn't recognize. The temperature was dropping. July nights in Belarus could be cool, and Hartmann had no blanket, no fire, and nothing to ward off the chill. He would be cold tonight. He would be colder tomorrow. He closed his eyes. The forest breathed around him, indifferent to his presence and indifferent to his ending. The war continued somewhere beyond the trees, tanks rolling, armies clashing, maps being redrawn in blood. But here, in this clearing, there was only silence. Hartmann didn't open his eyes again. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.